Is everyone able to hear me okay? Great.
Okay, very nice.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning or evening, depending on where you are. I'm John Espinaudenaren, editor-in-chief of China Brief and China Program Manager here at the Jamestown Foundation in Washington, D.C. I think this is a very timely topic, today's topic of China-South Korea relations. We know, of course, that the news cycle this past year has been dominated by Ukraine and Taiwan, but we're going to talk today about the Korean Peninsula, where I think it would be fair to say that not all has been tranquil in the land of the morning calm. So yesterday, North Korea launched its tested its sixth ballistic missile in 12 days. And the United States' ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, while criticizing the launch, also criticized two fellow UN Security Council members, Russia and China, for enabling North Korea's recklessness and aggression. North Korea's escalation adds to the already significant foreign policy challenges facing the new Yoon administration in Seoul. Of course, on the campaign trail, then candidate Yoon had promised a tougher line on China and closer ties with the United States. And to some extent, he's made some steps in that direction. South Korea participated in a NATO summit for the first time in Madrid, Spain, and also just announced a decision to lease more land to the U.S. THAAD missile defense system. On the other hand, there are signs of some continuity in Yoon's China policy. He sort of pointedly made a point of not being able to meet with Speaker Pelosi in person after she visited Taiwan and stopped in South Korea. And there was also quite a bit of high-level official participation in the commemoration of the 30-year anniversary of the normalization of China-South Korea relations. But still, during Vice President Kamala Harris's recent visit, both sides emphasized solidarity and the importance of the relationship. Okay, so with that, I think I've spoken enough. I'd like to introduce our two fantastic speakers who are going to talk us through the relationship today. And the first is Darcy Draw. Darcy is a postdoctoral research associate at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. She also holds non-resident fellowships at the George Washington University's Institute for Korean Studies, the Korea Economic Institute, and actually my former place of employment, the National Bureau of Asian Research. So thanks so much, Darcy, for being with us here today. And she's going to talk us through the sort of broad political and diplomatic overview of the relationship. We also have with us here today, and we're very grateful to him for joining us, given the 12-hour time difference, Joshua Namtae Park, and he's a senior researcher with the Institute for Asian Strategy. But he's also, very importantly, retired Republic of Korea naval captain, and he is a PhD from Texas A&M University. So really has both sort of the scholarship chops, but also the practical experience. And he wrote, I really encourage everyone to check it out, a fantastic piece looking at South Korea and China's strategic perspectives on the Yellow Sea. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Darcy, who has some slides and is going to give us an overview before we turn to Joshua. Thanks so much, Darcy.
Sure, yes. Thank you first, John, for inviting me. This is such a perennial issue, and I think that there's a lot of subtle changes going on these days on the Korean Peninsula between South Korea and China. And so it's a nice moment, I think, to take stock of what these patterns might mean and where it might mean that Seoul can go in the future. So my major takeaway that I hope everybody can come away with is that South Korea has always been sensitive to U.S. China rivalry. It's certainly become sharper in the past few years. But at the same time, their diplomatic decisions aren't yet a foregone conclusion. Specifically, I think that in Washington, still, the prevailing narrative is that Seoul is grappling how to manage its security interests and its economic interests as somehow something that it needs to choose between. But what I really want to clarify is that I think Seoul, and this is based on conversations that I've had in Seoul and Washington and elsewhere, Seoul has a much more nuanced outlook toward China that, frankly, I think many in Washington give them credit for. And they have a really big task in front of them. So I'm going to focus on two main things in my remarks. First, I'm going to look a bit at diplomatic patterns and what it means for South Korea's strategic outlook toward China. And then second, I'm going to mention some of the economic patterns as it pertains to South Korea's view of China, because I think it helps develop the greater contours of what this means, this supposed choice South Korea faces. And I'm going to wrap up with some implications for the Yoon administration and the South Korea-US alliance, but that I'm happy to talk about a little bit more in our Q&A. So first, as it pertains to diplomatic patterns, first I'd like to start off with some public opinion polls. These are all done by the Asan Institute, which is a think tank in South Korea. They've been running public opinion surveys for the past decade or more, I think. But they have some really great longitudinal data. Are we good? Okay, great. So oh, now I lost my notes. Pardon. Okay, yeah. So if we look at this trend line, like very clearly the United States is the favored nation among South Korean public opinion. Right, we saw a bit of a dip in that, I think, in 2019, and this was following the stalled talks between North Korea and Washington, where there was a bit of an uptick too, if you notice, with Washington too. But consistently, the United States is much more favorable. Another way of looking at this is looking at favored politicians, favorite state leaders, and so when Biden came into office, I think it was a breath among South Koreans that were potentially returning to a state of more stable relations, particularly following the volatility of the Trump administration's request for South Korea, specifically to pay more for US force presence. The other one that, for this discussion, as we can see, Xi Jinping is this red line, and it's really just gone just an average trend line downward. Certainly in 2017, after the introduction of the THAAD system into South Korea, that's when it really took a hit, and the Chinese response to that was really, I think, both in terms of sanctioning South Korean goods, as well as Chinese public's boycotting of South Korean goods and products in stores really soured South Koreans' opinion of China at the time, and it really hasn't recovered. So why am I mentioning all of this? All of this is really important when we think about South Korea, because foreign policy and international relations are very much a voting issue among the public, and the president's office in particular, which is very strong as it pertains to policy making in South Korea, is quite sensitive to these public backlash and these public opinions. And so, I want us to think back to 2012 when Lee Myung-bak attempted to pass through a GSOMIA agreement with Japan, an information sharing agreement, kind of in a backroom deal, and only revealed it to the public a day before. And the public, certainly when it comes to Japan issues, it's laden with a lot of questions about history and historical memory, but it really provoked the ire of the National Assembly and the public, and even led to 2 high-ranking officials resigning. And so what happened was this president's office had to withdraw just an hour before signing the agreement. So I mention all this because China issues are now becoming politicized, certainly not in the same way that Japan is. The historical memory of colonialism really overpowers a lot of that relationship. But China issues are becoming politicized now in a different way. So I think instead of being laden with history as it is with Japan, I feel like there's a sense of growing bitterness among the public that China feels it can strong arm Seoul, especially a Seoul that has emerged as a global leader when it comes to diplomacy, when it comes to economics, as one of the top OECD nations. And now, especially, Korea is a cultural leader in the world. And I think Seoul is is responding to that public sentiment. So as what does this mean for the strategic outlook? I think this means that the strategic outlook in Seoul is a bit different now. So for a long time, as I mentioned, there's this idea that China's the most important for its economic goals, whereas Washington is most important for its security goals. Certainly the U.S. ROC alliance is the foundation on which South Korea has developed as a modern industrialized democracy, particularly in such a volatile region as Northeast Asia. So what I want to do is kind of paint a broader picture of how South Korea's economic landscape is, because I think it's a bit more diverse than a lot of people give it credit for. So the first slide I'm going to throw up here is the countries with which South Korea has FTAs. South Korea has, it has about, I think it's 18 FTAs signed all around the world. So you can see that South Korea is actually not just a regional, a Pacific economic powerhouse. It really is a global economic powerhouse. And this goes beyond things like Samsung and Hyundai. It's quite a diversified trading, especially as it pertains to exports. So we have cars and electronics. I'm not sure if my cursor is showing up. Cars and electronics are the bulk of its trading, but it also has smaller goods and consumer products that it's trading around the world. And the other thing that I want to point out is that while China remains one of its biggest trading partners, with the United States, the export growth is slowing. So what this infographic is showing is that in China, it's in the negatives. It's the growth is slowing a lot. The second thing that I'm going to bring up just while I'm on the slides is, historically, the United States is perceived as the most important country for Korea's security. And then when it comes to economy, the narrative that China was the most important held true until 2017, till the THAAD issue, when the United States was seen as a much more trustworthy, I think, and consistent trading partner for South Korea. Let's see. So flipping back. So so the geostrategic outlook, the economic outlook, I think is a bit more complex. And South Korea recognizes, and the South Korean public recognizes this. I'm only going to mention briefly the importance of the CHIPS bill or CHIPS Act, and it's really made clear the strategic competition that the United States has securitized areas such as semiconductors, and more broadly, shipping lines, all of these kinds of things the United States has securitized. Korean exports, particularly in the semiconductor domain, has been quite volatile when it concerns China. It's been up and down over every month. It goes up and it goes down. So this is something that Seoul is going to have to be aware of and figure out. But it's by no means a foregone conclusion that Seoul wants to somehow divest from China. Back in August, and this was after the Pelosi visit that John had mentioned, Foreign Minister Park Jin visited China, and he made it clear that, talking with the United States about economic issues, about global production, about supply chains was in no way meant to exclude or target a specific country. And so Seoul is trying, the Yoon administration is trying to send a message to China that despite its rhetoric that it's somehow going to take a tougher line on China, it's by no means going to be cutting it off from security, from political, from economic, even from cultural and people-to-people concerns. So I'm going to wrap up here with the kind of third point is, what does this mean for the Yoon Suk-yeol administration? I think it's certainly at a point where they're trying to reorient, but there's a bit of ambiguity and indecision about where it wants to go. And certainly the environment right now that the South Korea finds itself in is pretty tough. I haven't mentioned North Korea so far. I'm happy to address specific questions in our Q&A, but the reason that I've mentioned it is that Pyongyang, particularly since, certainly since COVID, it's really isolated itself, but really since the failed talks with Washington and Seoul during the Moon administrations, it's really, there's no reason for Pyongyang from their opinion, from their perspective, to reach out. And so what does this mean for how Seoul approaches Beijing? There's not really an opening. There's not really even for Beijing to talk to Pyongyang. And so the kind of narrative that Seoul needs to work with Beijing on North Korea issues right now is just kind of a non-starter, unfortunately, for all parties involved. There's the other thing that I'll wrap up with is that this question about Yoon administration somehow being tougher on China, the public opinion on South Korea souring toward China, means that there's growing space for greater United States, South Korea cooperation to bolster Washington's strategy towards China is kind of, I think, missing the broader point of the nuances as it pertains to Seoul's position. So I know this is a bit ambiguous, but on the one hand, Seoul does recognize China is looming over any choices it wants to make. But it has made many of the strategic choices already that I think Washington thinks it needs to make, such as, bolstering the security the relationship with the United States alliance is stronger than ever, I think, particularly since the Biden administration has come into office. A lot of the routine, working level talks that happen between the two allies have been stronger, more so than ever. The question now for Seoul is, well, what are we going to do with the alliance? It's not really a question of blocking out Beijing or blocking out or engaging Pyongyang. It's really how it's going to be facing the kind of broader issues that are going to be brought to the table, such as the economic, the trading questions, and I haven't mentioned Japan, but the trilateral question in the background. So I put a bunch of things on the table. I'm not sure if I took my full 15 minutes, but I'll cede them to the Q&A and to Dr. Park. So thank you.
Thank you, Darcy. That's really segues very well, I think, into Dr. Park's remarks. And you mentioned, used the word looming, how China is sort of looming over South Korea's strategic thinking, even if it's not always explicit. And Joshua, I think, is going to talk us through some of the ways it is looming, and he has some slides. So, Dr. Park, we will go over to you. I will get your slides up.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me, Dr. Naran, and also the very happy to talk with Dr. Trout. And I think that to start my talking, I think that it's very good setting, Washington, D.C., and the topic is Korean Peninsula. I'm here in Taipei, Taiwan. It's very interesting setting and also timely setting too. Okay, I think it over the offering remarks. What do I do comment present, then I think it over the recognition and perception of Korean as a native Korean, and how does Korea see China as well as China see Korea, that it would help to understand the Koreans' behavior, especially Yoon's government behavior, for helpful to you. Okay, next slide. And I think that this the one word that in order to explain current China to predict future, the starting point is the past history. Then next slide. Then this is the photo of origin of threat. China had been threatened all of his history. Unfortunately, as we all know about from all direction, China has been threatened. The northeast direction, this Korean Peninsula is one part of threat project made in China. Next slide. Let's jump into the past to the current. This is the modern China's perception of the geopolitical map. I cited it from the recited Korean book, but original sources, Chinese scholars thinking. It's categorized for four reasons. The center is the core zone, the most populated area, and then good living and good for planting. Then this is the core zone should be protected and preserved by China. Then South Korea is the categorized as a buffer zone, which were observe and mitigate the threat from outside. The next slide. The Korean as buffer zone in the history, on the right side of this, I selected 4 cases. The invasion of ancient China to Korean Peninsula. As also, I put the 1950s case, the Korean War case. But there are 2 conditions mainly China invade Korean Peninsula. First one is if the dynasty in Korean Peninsula did not comply to the dynasty of mainland China. The second condition was when Chinese dynasty internal control is established. Under 2 conditions, they send mobilize troops, send troops to invade Korea. The purpose of such invasion was not to conquer the territory or occupy, but to tame and make them be submissive to Chinese dynasty. Then 1950s case, the Korean War involvement, the most recent case. Then now we believe we are in the rough wave of U.S. China strategic competition. Unfortunately, now Koreans think that China perceives U.S. and South Korean alliance as a threat, especially USFK, U.S. forces in Korea is direct military threat for them. That case, the 2016 is a good example of them. Then they concern the South Korea buffer zone, the negative impact, then they concern that South Korea is becoming the outpost for pressing and encircling China. Then now their purpose for South Korea is loosen or weaken the solidity of U.S.-China alliance. Next slide. Then now, how does Korea see China? I think that this part I'd like to focus more and pay more attention and explain the time to you. Next slide. Then modern Korean self-identification, I titled like that. We have all Korean history over 3,000 years. Our ancestors had been connected with mainland China, and it granted a lot of civilization like Chinese letter and Buddhism and such like that. But 1945, when we were independent from Japanese colonial rule after Second World War, and 1949, when mainland China established People's Republic of China, at that time we were disconnected from the continent. But North Korea, they had been connected, continued to connect the mainland China, but South Korea, we are disconnected. And during over 70 years, U.S. provision of security, South Korea, we developed economy as well as democracy. Then 21st century Korea, we are really enjoyed freedom and as well as prosperity. Then the current, we are enjoying the freedom and prosperity really different from that those of our ancestors enjoyed. The left side, the photo is Joseon Dynasty photo. Then in that situation, we think it over. Then we deliver some question to ourselves. That is, how could we acquire such a beautiful outcome? And who did help us to acquire such freedom and prosperity? Those are things our ancestors did not enjoy. Then we find out that we were disconnected from the continent of China, but connected to maritime states. Then most maritime states, mainly United States, then most of our Korean wealth came from from foreign trade through ocean. Then it is very clear to us that then those of disconnection from the continent China, as well as conversely connect to maritime powers, result in our current beautiful outcome. Now we are enjoying. Now we thinking about sustain and maintain our freedom and prosperity. Then we think it over the current China. Then next slide. This is the development of the South Korea and China relations. Then it started since 1992. Official diplomatic relations established, and after that, the major area of economic sector, the two states has been developing the relations. But then in the process of that, around 2010, U.S. and China strategic competition has begun. Then 2016 and U.S. sad case happened. Then after that, the retaliation by China has been begun. We believe, South Korea believe that the retaliation of that is still going on. Then we think it over. How could we maintain and sustain our freedom and prosperity? Then do we coexist China? But geographically, we are neighboring states. We cannot move we cannot move far away from the China, and also we could not make China move away to a different place because that geographically we are connected. Next slide. Then this is the, as Dr. Trout similarly explained, that is the perception of Korea about China. That is 80% of Korea. This is data of this year, 2022. 80% of Korea perceive China as unfavorable, unfriendly. Then the turning point obviously is sad, because the before said we could not exactly know about CCP, Chinese Communist Party, which is slightly different from the Chinese our ancestor knew. Next slide. Okay, future direction. This year is 30 years anniversary of China-China diplomatic relations resumed. And a lot of events happen in Korea, take place in Korea. Then some people propose pink for the future. Some others are present or predict gray color. But for me, today I will take the perspective of security. Then I will take realistic perspective. We are now the ongoing war, the Russian-Ukraine war. Then a lot of implication lessons we are taking out from the war ongoing. Then listen to last month, a Finnish scholar visited Taiwan, and we talked about a lot about their decision and relations with Russia. Then, as we know, after war broke, Finland decides to join NATO. But in the international relations terminology, one of the international terminology is Finlandization, which refers to a behavior, a weaker state behavior who neighbor with strong powers. Then Finland has not been to bother, or they did less likely to oppose Russia so far. But after war broke, they were determined to join NATO, although Russian objection. They believe that they could not rely on their security and survival. They could not rely on their security on the strong powers' will. Then they choose to NATO collective system. After talking with a Finnish scholar, I think it over the relationship between South Korea and China. Then previous slide, I showed you the perception of Korea. And 2016, then we still believe that retaliation about THAAD is continuing so far. Then if such trend continues to in the future, Koreans may think the same way as Finland did. I don't know. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really, I think, gave us a good overview of the sort of strategic paradigms. And it's really interesting, Joshua, that you brought up Finland. So I think that's a sort of a parallel that hadn't occurred to me, but I've heard Finlandization used occasionally applied to the Korean Peninsula. So that's very interesting. We're now going to shift. I want to make a quick kind of housekeeping note. We had a little bit of issues with our YouTube live stream for the first 6 or 7 minutes, but it's now online, and we'll have a full recording of the program afterwards. I just want to get that out of the way. I do want to give everyone an opportunity in our great audience here joining us on Zoom to ask questions. So you can either directly put the questions into the chat box, or you can raise your virtual hand, and I will let you talk, and you can ask a question that way. So I will kind of take the moderator's prerogative and ask something that I've been quite curious about, which is how domestic developments in China are impacting these Korean perceptions, right? So you talked about that, and that was obvious, and North Korea and inter-Korean relations, and how that was sort of a point of no return. But I'm thinking about some of the things that have happened in China over the last 3 or 4 years. So, of course, or more recently, the zero COVID policy. And then last year, we know, of course, that Korea is very active in the cultural space and it derives a great amount of soft power, but also economic wealth from its cultural exports. And one of the things that has been happening under Xi Jinping as sort of this campaign to revive socialist morality has been a campaign against sort of pop artists, specifically Chinese artists, but has also started to bleed into K-pop artists and the fan groups, fan club, that spring up around them. And of course, from the CCP's perspective, this is very worrisome, right? And actually last year, the South Korean embassy in Seoul even lodged a protest. So how much are things like that, zero COVID, how much is that impacting the sentiments of people in South Korea? Maybe we'll start with you, Darcy, and then go to Joshua, and then hopefully we get some audience questions percolating in as you make your responses.
Sure. I'll just put a couple things on the table in response to that. I think firstly, I mean, the issue of cultural products and those kinds of things, I actually think is quite fascinating and a really important part of the story when it comes to public opinion and the pressures that are put on the government. I think sometimes we brush these aside as somehow fluff, but as I mentioned before, they're a really big factor in the political leaders' decision-making in South Korea. So when it comes to how they're being either institutionally suppressed by the CCP, like you mentioned, the fan groups and the cultural products, or if it's some sort of, I mean, we know that there's rising Chinese nationalist sentiment that's growing too. And so this is also causing frictions in Chinese, there's Chinese YouTubers who are claiming that kimchi started in China, and that, bibimbap, things like that they say are Chinese products that Koreans really do see as a sense of their identity, that has been, I think, for a long time, over hundreds of years. I think Dr. Park did a really great job of showing how South Korea was isolated for a long time, but has emerged as this global powerhouse, with both economic, cultural, and cultural, I don't want to say leadership in the world, a strong presence that's really a big part of how the Korean people and the various government agencies see part of their overall, not just policies, but strategies. And so you see, even the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, certainly the Ministry of Sports, Tourism, and Culture, like they actually put these as a big part of its strategy to outreach to the world. On the China side of things, this is also kind of souring their understanding of what South Korea is. So I mentioned before that I think there's a little bit of I said bitterness. I'm not sure if that's the exact word in Seoul, but I think that there's also that kind of sentiment in China toward South Korea that has emerged as this, this cultural powerhouse in the kind of sphere of influence that they had previously occupied for millennia. And so Seoul, South Korea, the Korean Peninsula has always been the little brother to Seoul, for a lot of the reasons that Dr. Pak had shown before, the kind of Confucianist legacies that tied South Korean political existence to its, in the suzerain system to China that now it's occupying differently. The last thing that I'll mention here, and that Dr. Pak also, maybe I'd like to hear him develop a little bit more, is the question of South Korea now as a vibrant democracy that protects rights, that protects individual liberties. That, I think there is a question right now in South Korea, particularly with in the Yoon administration seems to have questionably responded to some of the press freedoms in South Korea, but this is part of the public discussion. And so what this means, I think, is that South Korea public and leadership latch on to this idea of being part of the global democratic network of democratic states that China maybe is not able to join for a variety of reasons over the past few years, the kinds of actions that the CCP has taken.
Joshua, do you want to just speak a little, add anything to Darcy's comments, kind of about,
Yeah, I will put one thing that from the perspective of as a Korean, not as a scholar academic base about this cultural issue, then I want to say that Korea, regarding the cultural issue with China, Korea pretty much disappointed with Chinese behavior, because that culturally they I don't know exactly, but it looks like China will take out some cultural product made by originally Korea, take out it and replace and rename it as they developed. Then those of things that previously the negative perception still going on increase. Then for general public, they are not interested in political perspective, political escalation or something, but cultural perspective of these Chinese behavior pretty much impact on public perception. Then in a world as a typical Korean, we are very disappointed with Chinese behavior. Then it looks like the not appropriate manner as a strong power. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe to borrow a term from the U.S. context, there's some cultural appropriation going on China's part of sort of South Korean culture. That's a great point, and something I hadn't really thought about. Okay, we have some questions coming in, and the first one is for you, Joshua, actually from our Jamestown Foundation's president, Mr. Glenn Howard. And he wanted you to talk a little bit about China's strategic vulnerabilities in the Yellow Sea, which you discuss in your China Brief article. And actually, I believe you have some slides for this particular topic. Do you want me to pull those up, Dr. Pak? Yes. Go. You're muted, Joshua.
Okay. Thank you for your question, because I'm very happy to talk about maritime issue because of my background. Then the Yellow Sea and China, then I wrote the first article about the value. How could China see the Yellow Sea? But this time I went to a step ahead of the four, that their strategy on the Yellow Sea try to the dominance. But I will mention about the why the background, the reason I wrote first article. Currently most of the attention, most of the people pay attention to the hotspot, the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea, but they actually they are doing something on Yellow Sea. I noticed as a Navy officer. Then, but it's unattentive. It looks like unimportant, but it has a meaning because of their strategy. I want one thing. My experience as a Navy officer in the Yellow Sea, and mentioned and start to explain the PPT. When I was a lieutenant junior grade, 1994, it was the first time I encountered Chinese vessels on the West Sea. Then it was my ship was a corvette ship, which is the Cheonan class, which is sunk by North Korean torpedo. It's around 10,000 tons, but Chinese Navy ship was around 500 tons. Very Hainan class is imported by Russia, Soviet Union. Then but right now we have still used such the Cheonan class corvette ship. However, the Chinese vessel, the 500 tons, disappeared on their fleet list. They replaced very brand new ship. Almost in a year, I believe they built over 10 ships more. It's a very quick of naval ship building their program. And are they doing? They are doing on something Yellow Sea. Then now I try to explain in terms of strategy. Then it's maybe interest to you. Next slide. Then world view I skipped. There was strategic thinking. I a little bit explain and try to go to next. Chinese strategic thinking is deception. Oh, previous one, please. Deception as fake and deception, exaggeration are easily justified, but it is not unique or exclusive in cultural strategic culture. It's not unique for China, but in this trend, China has relatively strong tendency about it. Then Sun Tzu Bing Fa, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, the first chapter, he argued that the principle of strategy is deception, and he presented 13 ways of to deceive others. One of them is that if it is important to me, let's make opponent unimportant, unattentive. That is one of the strategy. The second strategic way of doing is long-term and shrewd planning. I don't know. I would not explain more, but the Weiqi game, Mr. Kissinger on his book on China compared to Weiqi game, one of the popular game in Asian society, including China. The third one is dialectical approach. Use two different means to contending can be complementary. For example, Taiwan's unification policy, they do pursue peaceful unification, but they do not use military means. Then non-military means and military means are contradictory. However, they believe that it's complementary. The next slide. Right side of photo is about Wei Qi, Chinese in Japan goal. Then a grid of 18 by 18 inches and white stone and black stone. Then if a gamer put a white one, place their stone very isolated area, and then it looks like unimportant. However, the skillful gamer have to take place their stone and counter attack immediately. If it ignores it, they will lay more and more stones and connect it. I believe that this is the manner Mr. Kissinger described Chinese strategic thinking in this way. I believe it can be comparable to Yellow Sea case. Yellow Sea is like very isolated and attentive area. Now we all focused on Taiwan Strait as well as South China Sea, but on the Yellow Sea they do something, then they say that, oh, it is not important. It's not important. You do not interested in. That is a Chinese man. Next slide, please. Okay, the right side is the one player put more and more, laying more and more stones, connected it, and right side is like this. After those of placing stone, then we could not, it's very hard to counterattack or could not recover it. Then right side the photo is the stones we connected from Yellow Sea to Taiwan Strait and finally reach that South China Sea, which is the line very similar to first island chain. I believe that in the China is doing in that manner, and China used such strategy to dominate Yellow Sea and finally will reach to the other area like Taiwan Strait and finally the South China Sea. Next. Then this is the my policy, sort of policy implication. Then I believe that the Yellow Sea, northern part of Yellow Sea, I believe to some degree China already took some superiority or dominance. But the southern part of Yellow Sea still had room for doing. Then I specifically located the choke point. Choke point in military terminology, but refers to a specific geographical position we have to pass through in order to reach destination. Then this choke point has three strategic meaning. First meaning is that choke point is the gateway of Yellow Sea. And if we take this, the gateway, we control the whole Yellow Sea. The second meaning is this is the connecting point with Japanese territory from Pacific side and east side. Japanese fleet now divided by two, Pacific side and east sea side. They could, it could be connected through their channel. But the Japan has 4 big islands. Between the island, there is some narrow channel. The naval ship could use it alternatively. but main channel should be passed through there. Then second meaning is of the choke point is that is the above the East China Sea. Then in the military sense, in order to win the battle, a lot of various conditions should be established. But one condition is establish a real base for reinforcement and logistic support. Then this choke point could be the real base of East China Sea. As you see that East China, there is a contending area and territorial disputes, Senkaku Island, Daoidao Island. Then China thinking they put more value on East China Sea, and above this, the choke point could be the role of this. Then one important thing is neither side still yet dominate this choke point. Then I believe that this, if we do something right away, then we will take a very strategically advantageous position there. Then also in one spot, this Katra lock, the Yodo, which is a submerged lock. Then submerged lock, there is no right to have territorial the sea. But at their 2003, South Korea established a manned scientific research base there. Then China still criticize about that the base. Then that could be a possible cause when China made trouble in the Yellow Sea. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that's such an important point. We can't just think about, the Yellow Sea in isolation. Has to be considered in the broader strategic context. And I think that ties in. We've got a couple questions, actually, probably unsurprisingly, on Taiwan, right? And what role would South Korea play in Taiwan? Joshua, you're in Taiwan, so why don't you tell us a little bit about maybe the perspective on that, and Darcy, if you can kind of add to Joshua's point on it, and maybe kind of South Korea's thinking about sort of Taiwan in general and what it means.
Okay. Thank you very much for a question about Taiwan. I'm in Taiwan. Then, okay. I think that we are the very close to run out of time, but I jump into the main point. Regarding the Taiwan issue, we have basically the basic attitude regarding Taiwan is we try to be neutral. However, we have some the relations with Taiwan that for especially this Yoon's government, then he pretty much focused on the value of democracy and freedom. Then we share the same the value was Korea and Taiwan. Also, we had thanked for them when we were independent movement under Japanese colonial rule. Exactly, Chiang Kai-shek government, he helped and supported Korean independence, and finally we were independent. We had thanked about that help. Then we have sympathy about Taiwan issue, but basically we try to be neutral. But however, recently a lot of the issues, some U.S. high officials and generals talks about the strategic flexibility of U.S. forces in Korea. In other words, if it's necessary, the U.S. could transfer the USFK to Taiwan issue. Then then our government, then the first priority of our security concern is North Korea. Then we want to more focus on Korean issue and North Koreans' provocative behavior. Then that is the Korean government basic posture and the opinion. But however, there is some variable that recently when the East Sea had the combined exercise, during combined exercise, North Korea shoot the missile, the ballistic missile looks like target at United States aircraft carrier on there. Then one of the variable is then if we try to be neutral in terms of Taiwan issue, basically, however, if China militarily do something on Korean territory, then USFK, they are stationed at Korean territory, our territory, even they are US forces. But if they do something militarily or attack or shoot us or something, then consider, rethink about the basic policy, the Taiwan issue, that basically, as I told you, that to be neutral. Then those of then China, I think that we need to clearly express our intention, those of intention to China, because that then we try to be neutral as much as possible. But in that case, if we were attacked by such a military way, we have to think, rethink and revise it. And I believe that we have to send clear message to China. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Darcy, anything to add to that on South Korean perspectives on Taiwan and specifically a possible Taiwan contingency?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. And it makes me think of and listening to Dr. Park's remarks, like in response to Hurricane Ian, I heard a couple weeks ago, I read a meteorologist said, regarding the future of the hurricane, we have 100% chance of ambiguity, which I think, I wish my job could be saying 100. Well, it is kind of, because I do think it's a little bit ambiguous. Just as a point, I think a news event that I think symbolizes this sense of ambiguity. After Pelosi visited Taiwan in August, some public opinion polls show that Korean attitudes toward the United States slipped just a couple percentage points. It did the same in the United States' other ally, Japan. But at the same time, South Korean attitudes toward China also dipped. Right, so it's not like an either or situation. Moreover, after Pelosi visited Taiwan, she went to South Korea, and there was a lot of public and policy elite concern that Yoon did not meet with Pelosi and didn't send anybody to meet her. And so there is still this understanding that recognizing the Taiwan issue can't be a way, it can't be a reason to kind of shirk larger alliance duties as it comes to the South Korean president. The other thing that I want to bring this back to, kind of thinking historically in the broad, Dr. Park did such a nice overview of the history, but there's a question about whether the Finland comparison fits for South Korea. I recognize David Lin's point that China never tried to occupy Korea. And if you think about it, that's true in its long history. Professor Jiyoung Lee at American University is doing some really great work looking at this kind of puzzle. Why hasn't China invaded Korea, particularly because of this kind of buffer zone area that's plagued it for centuries. But you have to remember that Chinese actually did occupy part of the Korean Peninsula during the Korean War. In 1950, Mao Zedong sent soldiers, and these 3 million soldiers were largely instrumental to pushing back United States South Korean forces early on in the active part of the war in 1950, and they continued to be there until 1958. So there is this complicated question for Seoul. How do we see China, given this really complicated history as former suzerain, as part of backing up the North Korean forces for the past 70 years. And so I think the comparison is helpful to kind of disentangle what's different and what's similar in that respect. I know we're quite over time, so I'll stop there. I hope I gave enough nuance to that question.
It's a great point, and I think just to bring it in a little from the Chinese perspective, I think these discussions will intensify, right? Because of China's own immense ambitions, I think, for Asia, but also globally. So, as China pursues this community of common destiny through things like the Global Security Initiative and things like that, having at least, nominal buy-in from a country like South Korea, given the historical legacy, I would think would be very important. But I think it's very much a question, how will South Korea respond to this? I think that could maybe be a whole other event. And we'll have some post 20th Party Congress programming, kind of looking at China's foreign policy. I want to thank Darcy and Joshua just for an incredibly insightful discussion. You can find the discussion on our YouTube page or on jamestown.org, our events page, I'll tweet it out also on China Brief Twitter as well. And then, encourage you to look at all our coverage of Asian politics, China, South Korea, on China Brief, Jamestown's China Brief site. Thank you so much. Everyone have a great weekend. Darcy, Joshua, thank you so much. Really appreciate you both being here with us today.
Oh, thank you. And thanks to all the participants.
Yes, thanks for joining us.
Attendees. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a
Thank you.
nice weekend.
Thank you. You do the same. Thanks. Take care, everybody.